Hello and welcome to another episode of Raw Chatter. I am your host speaking, Vicky Midwood, integrative health, nutrition and lifestyle coach, and of course, the addiction eliminator. And I am here again with Dana Chapman for part 2 of our discussion around all things ADHD. Now, last time we spoke about nutrition and the importance of it, especially in eating disorders and disordered eating, which was a cracking episode. So, folks, if you haven't listened to that one, please go back and listen to it. This one is slightly different topic, isn't it, Dana? This is about the age that women get diagnosed with ADHD. So I'm going to say over to you, jump on in, let people just know a little bit about you, what you do, and then we'll dive into the topic.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Vicky. It's so lovely to be here again. I am a nutritional therapist specializing in ADHD, and I spend a lot of time talking about the gut-brain axis and the importance of gut health in ADHD and in mental health, which we spoke about a lot in the previous call. Today, we are obviously going to be focusing on more specifically, female hormones and when women often get diagnosed with ADHD. So the research has shown, in the past, we know that men have typically been diagnosed more than women.
Yes.
Women often get misdiagnosed with depression and or anxiety, and because they've got that diagnosis, they get sent out of the system because they have the diagnosis, therefore they must go and get the treatment program.
Yeah.
But there are three.
I was just going to say, I'm just going to jump in there because I think that's really important for any women to take on board, because it's such a common diagnosis, isn't it, for females, depression and anxiety. And what we do know, as you've said in the research, that a lot of the research that was originally done on ADHD was only done in boys because it showed up more obviously in boys, and the symptoms in young girls are not the same, are they? So that's kind of the sort of the background behind why it wasn't kind of picked up in girls as even being a thing that girls had. So thank you for that.
Unless girls had more of that outward hyperactive type presentation. So girls and women often get diagnosed with more of the inattentive ADHD, and boys often get diagnosed more with the hyperactive type of ADHD. We don't really know reasons as to why, but generally that is what happens. Boys are more external or externalize their symptoms, whereas girls often internalize their symptoms. And I think that may be part of the reason why it ends up being a depression or anxiety diagnosis. But hopefully we have come a long way. Hopefully doctors and GPs and specialists who are diagnosing these days are more aware of also the inattentive traits as well as more of those hyperactive traits. So yes, you're completely right.
Can you go through just some of the classic traits that we would kind of refer to as being the inattentive ones?
Yeah, so daydreaming, specifically in a class, not being able to finish tasks, starting many new things but not following through. So those are more of the inattentive type symptoms. Whereas, the hyperactive symptoms people know about. It's the naughty boy who can't sit still in class. It's the person who is constantly talking or interrupts people while they are having a conversation. So
that's great.
It's more, it's you can almost think of it as introvert or extrovert. Almost. It's a massive generalization, but that may help with how you think about it.
I think that's really clear, because people just are not always quite sure what do we mean by the kind of when we go inside, but that's that daydreaming, it's that kind of zoning out, it's not being able to complete things because we get sidetracked and what have you. So fantastic, thank you.
Pleasure. So what we're speaking about today is girls being diagnosed at specific points in their life, and the research is showing that girls and women are diagnosed at 3 main points in a female's life.
Right.
One of them is adolescence, another is just after having a baby, so postpartum,
Right.
and the third time is during perimenopause or menopause. So obviously the research then delves a little bit deeper into questioning why is it these three specific periods that women or girls get diagnosed. And it's very clear to see then that female hormones have a large role to play in those neurotransmitters that are often implicated in ADHD. And I
Yeah.
think we got across from the last discussion that it's not just dopamine that we should be thinking about, although estrogen does have a large role to play in almost activating that dopamine, but it also does the same for serotonin, which is more of that homecoming, that calming and relaxing neurotransmitter.
And I think that's a really powerful point to make, because it's clearly when we think about those three stages that you've noticed, it's when, in very general stereotypical kind of social condition terms, is our female hormones are going through a bit of a chaotic change,
Yeah.
going into puberty, just having had a baby, and then perimenopause. There's so much shifts. And what we do know, don't we, now from the research, is that we think of these hormones as being female kind of hormones, but really
Mm,
they are brain hormones. And
mm,
that's what we've got to try and help, I think, society to start shifting, because they play a crucial role in how the brain functions, and not just
mhm.
how we behave, but how we feel, think, but also how we process things. And that's where I think this is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're completely right. So we do make estrogen in the brain, and we have what we call estrogen receptors in the brain as well. And what's important to understand is it's not just the fact that there may be estrogen there or not, that estrogen has to dock to that estrogen receptor for it to actually become active. And that's almost often
Mm.
the part that people don't actually think about. And what I find, especially these days, is there are so many things in our environment, products that we use on our skin
Right.
that can bind to these estrogen receptors,
Yeah.
which means that your actual estrogen cannot bind to it. So
Right.
I'm finding lots of females these days are having much more symptomatic periods, but also much more symptomatic perimenopause and menopause. And we're
Wow.
not thinking about we're not thinking about the nutrients that are needed for these female hormones,
Mm.
which are very similar to the nutrients that are needed to make our neurotransmitters.
Right.
So you're thinking about things like magnesium and vitamin B6 are
Mm.
two key nutrients that are important both for dopamine and serotonin production, but also for estrogen production. So,
Right.
yes, we need to be thinking about that side of it, but we also need to be thinking about what are the things in our environment that can actually disrupt our hormones as well.
And these are actually known as hormone disruptors, aren't they? So, do you
Yeah.
want to give us an example of? You've mentioned things like our skincare, women's skincare
Hmm.
products,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
that's just kind of one of them. And
Yeah.
are there specific chemicals that are in these things that are the guys that we should be looking out for?
There are. To be honest, I can't give you a long list because I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but it's a group of molecules
Yeah.
called Zen estrogens,
Right.
which
Yeah.
you find in things like pesticides and herbicides, in plastic,
Right.
and in face care products. So things like phthalates,
Yeah.
sulfates. Those are the sorts of ingredients that we need to be looking out for. And I mean, there's lots of talk around before a lady leaves the house, she's put on her body at least 17 different products.
Wow.
But if you think about it, in the shower, it's your body wash,
Yeah.
it may be your shampoo and conditioner, it may then be your face wash. You get out the shower and you put a toner on and maybe a serum and then maybe a face cream. And then maybe you're going to put deodorant on, and then maybe you'll put on perfume.
Right.
And then what about your makeup as well? So you'll put a base on, a blusher, eyeliner, eyeshadow, mascara. That's already
Wow.
14 different products that you've put on your skin. And each of those products will have a number of ingredients in them. So you're talking 14 to 17 products, but how many ingredients are you actually using on your skin? And that's just a female's morning routine. What
Right.
about the things that you're exposed to via food? I mean, you might put body cream on afterwards when you get out of the shower, but what about food? What
Mhm.
about the plastic that your food is wrapped in or that you store your food in overnight? So there's
Right.
lots of things actually environmentally that you can consider as well.
And so this is where just even some little shifts and changes can
Mm,
make a difference, because obviously it's the accumulative effect, isn't it, of
yeah,
using these things over time, which then kind of makes sense that that would coincide with symptoms being picked up at sort of perimenopause age, because potentially we've been using these products for 20 plus years by
yeah,
this point. So
yeah,
that's a long time for them to have had an effect internally, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. And then
And
obviously perimenopausally, your ovaries just drop off a cliff in terms of producing estrogen.
right, so help people to understand that the connection between estrogen and what's going on with the brain, and if we can, how perhaps something like HRT could potentially help them to
Mhm.
feel better and also help them to manage their ADHD symptoms.
Yeah. So estrogen is actually made in the brain as well as being made in the ovaries. And actually, perimenopausally, what happens is often your adrenal glands pick up a bit of the slack of producing more estrogen.
Right.
But estrogen is needed in the brain in specific brain regions that are very important for that need to focus. And I'm sure anyone going through perimenopause or menopause knows that you may get midway through a sentence and then actually forget what you're saying. Um, and
There'll be
that
so many
is,
people listening to this going, yep, that's me
yeah.
nodding away. Yeah.
And shifts in mood. How many women postmenopausally are really struggling
Yeah.
with depression and or anxiety?
Yeah.
And I think we place so little emphasis on the strength of hormones and the role that they play in our body and emotions.
Mm.
And it's estrogen, the current understanding is estrogen is needed to activate not only dopamine, which is that neurotransmitter that's going to give you motivation, reward, that seeking to do something, and that working memory.
Right.
Dopamine is needed for that, and estrogen is really important in helping activate that dopamine. But it's the combination of the estrogen and the estrogen receptors that kind of kicks off that whole loop.
Yeah.
Progesterone also plays a role, so we can't negate the role that
Nope.
progesterone has, but we that progesterone only has a role after the estrogenic effect.
Right.
And postmenopausally, we don't really produce that progesterone because progesterone is produced by the egg that we release on a monthly basis. So,
Yeah.
has that answered your question?
Yeah. And I think that the thing that we need to help people to recognize is that these hormones, if people wonder why before my period do I get, irritated or
Mm,
cross
mm,
or maybe
mm,
teary, and
mm.
it's these mood changes that they notice, but they don't really understand just
Yeah.
how the hormones are working, and why therefore around our period that we maybe crave certain types of foods as well, because there's
Mm,
that whole gut brain axis link that
mm,
goes on, isn't there?
mm,
And our food affects our mood, and then
mm,
our mood affects the food we want to go for, but our hormones are also affecting our mood, and that's affecting how our brain actually functions.
mm,
And so for people who because I want to just touch on, obviously, social media. We can't ignore it. It's a
Mhm.
double-edged sword. It's great for some things, and it really is not helpful for others because there's so much misinformation. But there's a general, I think, feel, and I don't know if you agree with this, that ADHD is like suddenly trendy and more
Mm,
common. Um,
mm,
but I think you've clearly explained why there's been misdiagnosis going on. So,
mm.
do you think overall there are more people who are genuinely struggling with symptoms of ADHD because, or in part because of all of these environmental factors that you've mentioned are affecting estrogen and the hormones? What are your thoughts on that?
Difficult to say on the ADHD side, but I think they're definitely having an effect on the hormone side. And then, yes, of course, ADHD is going to come into that as well, because so many more people are struggling with hormonal symptoms.
Yeah.
So many more women are being diagnosed with things like PCOS, and it's quite high in the ADHD community as well. So PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so, yes, I think a lot of people are struggling, and a lot of people still don't know what ADHD is and what the symptoms are. I mean, I'm working with a coach, and she said, oh, her daughter did an ADHD, one of those online ADHD diagnosis things.
Right.
And her daughter came out with like 70%. And she said, oh, yeah. And then I did it, and I came out with about 85%. And then she said, that would explain a lot. So I think there are still so many people out there
Yeah.
who, yes, it's becoming more trendy, but if we actually had to screen people, and if we had the resources to screen them, I think we would see the percentages at much higher than what we estimate ADHD is, which at the moment is about 7% of the population.
Right. And that's a really cool stat to throw out there, because 7% of the population is not that high, even
No.
though people think that, well, it's everywhere and everybody's got it. That's obviously, that is not the case, is it?
Yeah.
And just to help people, because you made a really good point there, that a lot of people don't actually really understand what ADHD is. I know it's a bit putting you on the spot, but would you like to try and explain just in simple terms so people can kind of grasp what is ADHD?
So ADHD, the physiology of it is that there is an imbalance in chemicals in the brain. So those chemicals in the brain help provide us with things like the ability to focus, the ability to start a task and finish a task, the ability to be motivated to do things on a daily basis, the ability to make dinner and have the working memory to know what ingredients I need to put in first because they take the longest to cook, and what ingredients take 5 minutes to do, I can do in the last 5 minutes of my meal prep. So, I mean, it's simple day-to-day tasks like that, but it often manifests in childhood. That's when you notice it, because children need to conform to the schooling system, which is that you need to sit there and listen for X amount of time and be attentive, be present, and actually engage in something.
Amazing.
I hope that has given a little bit of understanding as to what ADHD is. A lot of people talk about emotional regulation as well, and that being a key missing thing in people with ADHD is they find it incredibly difficult to regulate their emotions and to not overreact to certain situations because of, again, it's just the number of chemicals that are imbalanced within the brain. I mean, that's what it comes down to, is those brain chemicals aren't working as a neurotypical person's brain chemicals work, and that's what causes these symptoms of the inattention or the lack of focus.
Brilliant. And I'm just going to add a little bit to that in terms of how the brain actually physically looks. When we look at brain scans of people who have got a neurotypical brain versus an ADHD brain, what we've discovered is that actually people with ADHD have slightly smaller brains and they have fewer connections between brain regions.
Yeah.
And so this is where, as you said, it's that chemical imbalance or chemical insufficiency or receptor insufficiency or a combination of
Yeah.
all of those things. Hence, ADHD is not the same in everybody. And therefore, you can't say, well, these are the symptoms, tick, 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 because
Yeah.
that's not how it works, is it? Everybody's experience of it is slightly different. And I think you've
Yeah.
explained beautifully there how it affects day-to-day stuff.
Mm.
And what I've come across, particularly because there's a lot of people, as you say, those three main key points are when a diagnosis tends to be more likely to be made. But it still means, if we look at puberty, that's still quite a lot of years that a girl has had to navigate
Mm.
how to function in a world where people are not perhaps very understanding or very
Mhm.
tolerant
Mhm.
of, why is she not concentrating, or
Yeah.
why don't you finish what you start, or or
Mm.
maybe you're just a bit too much and a bit too loud or whatever. And
Mm.
one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about on this is RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, because that's something that starts quite young, doesn't it? And it's
Mm.
linked to, I believe, and I could be wrong, this is my opinion on this only, but
Mhm.
it's linked to the amount of years that we felt inadequate compared
Mm.
to.
Mm. Yes, completely agree with you, and agree that I've not read any research papers around it. But often, again, this is why girls get misdiagnosed, because they go with those symptoms of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and you come out with that diagnosis instead of the reason why she's feeling rejected is because of the ADHD. And I think girls want to conform, girls
Exactly.
want to be good, girls want to be seen to be doing the right things. And so there's a lot of energy that goes into masking.
Right. And that's a term that, again, people may have read or seen and
Mm.
perhaps don't fully understand what that means. And can you help people to, because when I've spoken to some of my clients who have had late diagnosis and we talk about masking, obviously they believe that's just who they are.
Yeah.
Because they've done it for so long, and we get this
Mm.
scenario of, I don't actually really know who I am
Mm.
because I've put this mask on for so long. Is that the real me, or is it the one I'm trying to
Mm.
portray? I don't actually know. So help
Yeah.
people to just get clarity on what is masking.
So masking is, I think we've alluded to it earlier, it is conforming to the way you should behave rather than behaving the way that you want to behave. And lots of people have described it as, the only way I knew I could keep my hands still was if I sat on them throughout the whole class.
Right.
So girls find these masking and coping mechanisms so that she is seen as the good girl and not being called out and sent for detention every week.
Right. So things like just keeping quiet rather
Hmm.
than speaking out of turn or interrupting, you just say nothing at all.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess that then means that over time it is going to kind of have a massive effect on your self-confidence, your self-worth, hence a depression diagnosis or anxiety. So you can see how it does get misdiagnosed, can't you?
Yes, you can. And I often think on a chemical level, you're dealing with the same neurotransmitters.
You are,
So,
yeah.
on a chemical level, depression and anxiety, again, is an imbalance in those neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin. And I don't think serotonin actually gets enough airtime in the
Doesn't.
ADHD world. But funnily enough, I've done genetic testing. I've only got an N of 2 at the moment. So I've only tested 2 people with ADHD, tested their specific genetic profile for their
Right.
neurotransmitters. And their problems are not the dopamine pathway, their problems are the serotonin pathway. and making serotonin. And from serotonin, we make our melatonin, which is the lovely hormone that helps us sleep.
Right.
So,
Yes. And that's another thing,
interesting.
isn't it? With people with ADHD, often sleep issues can be
Mm,
one of the things that actually leads to there being a diagnosis. Tell us a little
yeah.
bit more about what people may experience with their sleep if they have ADHD.
Often it is a I find that these days technology is not productive for somebody with ADHD, because it might be the constant scrolling and that looking for a dopamine hit at night.
Yeah.
And if you've got that blue light exposure on your eyes, that can block your melatonin production. So you will find it difficult to fall asleep because your body's not getting the cues that it's night time, should be dark, and I should be starting to feel sleepy. So, technology aside, people with ADHD often have 100,000 different thoughts, ideas. They tend to be really creative. And at night, when the brain is probably a little calmer from the day's activities, that's often when those hundreds of ideas start popping up into your brain.
Yeah.
So you find it very difficult to switch off. Lots of that going on.
Mm.
For me, it's the chemical imbalances as well. But uh, it may also be that people with ADHD just generally have a bit of a later chronotype anyway. And I think this has been spoken about. So a chronotype is your natural time that you would like to go to sleep. So if you
Right.
were on a desert island, what time would you actually settle down and fall asleep? For me, it would probably be about 9, 10 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
But for people with ADHD, it's often a little bit later.
Right.
And so if you're not naturally going with your chronotype, you then may get into bed and you don't feel tired. So
That's
it could
really
be that.
helpful. Yeah. So
Yeah.
compare, because this is something that, again, I think it's out there, but it's not really spoken about and it's not touched
Mm,
upon. I
mm,
think people more focus on, well, how do I switch my brain off when I go to bed at night? And they focus
mm,
on that side of it without asking, actually, is this time the right time for me to be
mhm,
going to bed?
mhm.
We all kind of know from the general, don't we, sleep research that ideally we do want to be going to bed before midnight, ideally.
Yeah.
But there are a small minority of people who are going to fall out of those parameters, and working with
Mm,
our body is key. And I think that is something that we kind of are a bit scared to do, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah. And society also doesn't always lend itself to that either. You have to be at work at 9 o'clock in the morning, or at school at, if you're a teenager, 8:30. If you're in junior school, it's 9 o'clock. So you don't really have the luxury of trying to push things out the next day unless you work for yourself.
Yeah.
One other point I wanted to make on sleep is, often people think that leading up to sleep, the hour or 2 hours leading up to sleep, is when you should be doing all of the stuff to help promote sleep.
Hmm.
Whereas it actually needs to start from the moment that you wake up. You
Yeah.
need to have sufficient daylight exposure on your eyes to be able to build up that melatonin. You need to make sure your blood sugar levels are quite balanced throughout the day, which some people with ADHD struggle with, especially if they have binge eating.
Mm.
So it's about, all the things that you do throughout the day, balancing your blood sugar levels, getting enough exercise, getting some daylight exposure, are all important to helping you fall asleep at night. It's not just the hour or two before you go to bed.
That's really helpful for people to hear, because it is, it's, I always say, a good night's sleep starts with a good morning.
Yeah.
And it's what we do when we first wake up. And yes, it's easy to say, where we live in this world where, it gets darker very early in the evening and it doesn't get
Yeah.
light later on. But if you can get out as close to when sun comes up and
Yeah.
just get out there and just let that light hit the back of your eye, it makes a massive difference. And as you say, creating a routine works. And that's something else I want to touch on, because
Mm.
for a lot of people with ADHD, obviously they get sucked into social media big time, and the shorts on TikTok are just perfect to reel us all in, not just people with ADHD. But they also pick up on a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I think people with ADHD struggle with is that they look at this stuff all about an evening routine and a morning routine, and I should be doing all of that and sort of copying what somebody else does. And reality is they're not likely to be able to stick to it. So are there some things that it's worth persevering trying to stick to? You've mentioned there getting up and getting early sunlight and daylight throughout and exercise. What else could people kind of really try and focus on doing to help themselves to manage the symptoms of poor sleep, for example?
So I would focus on, we touched on it last time, the nutrients that are needed.
Right.
So blood sugar balance would be the one other key thing. But it's always about keeping the end goal in mind to keep you motivated to do the things that you are wanting to do to help support yourself.
Right.
And I always say bring in one more thing at a time. Focus on one thing. Don't focus on, okay, tomorrow I'm going to get up and get some morning daylight exposure, and I'm going to exercise, and I'm going to make sure I eat protein at every meal. That is too much. You will get that. ADHD people often feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
You will feel overwhelmed. So make it manageable and achievable for yourself. In terms of food, because food is key, not only because you need nutrients to be able to create your melatonin, which is your sleep hormone, but food is needed to energize us throughout the day. And if your blood sugar levels are imbalanced throughout the day, then you will struggle to sleep because you may have a blood sugar dip in the middle of the night, and that might cause you to wake up.
Yeah.
So protein would be my one key other thing, other than exercise and getting daylight exposure, to help manage that, to help manage sleep specifically in ADHD. Because
Fantastic.
if you don't have a good night's sleep, whether you have ADHD or not, you will struggle to focus the next day.
Yeah. And anybody who is listening who isn't struggling with ADHD will know for sure, you know, none of us feel fantastic if we've had a poor night, but we can still function. But if you add on 2 or 3 or 4 poor nights, then you're really gonna struggle. And I think one thing that I think it's really important to touch on, especially in the world that we live in today, where it seems to be that we get praised, or there's an expectation to always be switched on and go, and productivity is like the key word. And a lot of people with ADHD struggle with time and getting organized. And as you said, one of the things is feeling overwhelmed. So do you have any kind of tips for people to help themselves feel less overwhelmed by what they have to do in the day, or to organize their time better so they don't get overwhelmed?
Yeah, time and time blindness is often a difficulty in ADHD.
Yeah.
I find one of the best tools that I have is time blocking specific time for specific things.
Right.
And setting timers. So often things like meals get missed because you're in hyperfocus, and so you've skipped lunch. Use timers if that's not going to overwhelm you or stress you out even more. I mean, people with ADHD are so prone to burnout because it is all go, go, go all the time.
Yeah.
And the key blocks I would put in is a half an hour either at the beginning or lunchtime or at the end of the day to just be mindful. And maybe that being mindful is having lunch, and you're just mindful, check in with how your body is feeling, what your energy levels are like, what your hydration levels are like. Check in with where you are. What have I achieved today? What is completely necessary for me to achieve before the end of the day? And just stick to those necessities, almost a red, green, and amber sort of scale on a to-do list, because we all think that we are invisible, but the body will shut down at a point if you haven't looked after it. So I think the one key thing I would say is set half an hour aside, and if half an hour is too much time, start with 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's a 10-minute walk where you do a check-in. Is this completely necessary for me to finish by the end of the day? Yes or no? If yes, how can I do it in a way that's not going to increase my stress?
Brilliant. That's really super, super helpful. What else do you feel that it's important for people to know about getting a diagnosis and ADHD?
I think I'll stick to the theme of female hormones. And what we didn't really touch on is the fact that our hormones fluctuate throughout the month naturally.
Yeah.
So naturally, in the second half of a reproductive woman's cycle, you may feel less motivated. That is okay. And lean into it. Don't try and fight against it. Try and shift your working to be in the first half, you're going to feel more motivated. What can you do in that first half of your cycle? And in the second half of your cycle, be kind to yourself. We are all human. The world will not fall apart if you don't do something that you said you would do, if you communicate that to the person you said you would do it to.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would emphasize. If women are listening to this and they have got girls or young ladies, if they are struggling with their mental health, please do consider the underlying cause to be ADHD, because it explains a lot, and going on antidepressants won't treat the root cause of the problem.
That's a really good thing to bring up, is that so many people, I think, are ashamed to some degree of getting an ADHD diagnosis, because somehow is it my fault, or as parents, is it something I've done? Did I cause my child to have an issue? And there's so much of this, particularly we're frightened of being judged, aren't we? And what will other people think, and all that kind of stuff. But that's really, really good advice. So do we know, or are we yet to find conclusively an answer to this question? Is ADHD something that we think is in families? Is it something that's hereditary?
Yes, so I think about 80% of ADHD is hereditary. So if mum or dad have it, it's likely that a child or multiple children in the family will have it. And that's actually why adult ADHD diagnosis rates are going through the roof, because parents are sitting down with a questionnaire of ADHD for their child, and they're going, oh, that's me.
That's me.
Oh, that's me. Oh, that's me. And that's why I think adult ADHD diagnosis rates are going through the roof at the moment.
And on that note of diagnosis, do you think that it is necessary for somebody to get an official diagnosis, either via their GP, because we know the lists are horrendously long, if you go via the NHS? Do you think it's necessary for people to have a diagnosis via that route, or do you think that actually some of these online ones that are available are sufficient, especially if you're an older adult?
It completely depends on the person and what they want from the diagnosis. If you are seeking it for your child and you feel like your child would benefit from extra time or extra support at school, that's definitely a reason to go for a diagnosis.
Sure.
Also, if you are wanting to trial medication, where I don't think the risks around medication are stipulated enough. But if medication is a route that you want to go down, then obviously you do need to seek a diagnosis, because you won't ever be able to access medication without a diagnosis.
Yeah.
There are many people out there who know that they've got ADHD. They don't necessarily need the piece of paper, because they've found coping mechanisms. They've found a way to live with it now. And they may be doing all of the more natural things, like focusing on nutrition, focusing on sleep, focusing on exercise. So if that's you, if you fit into that camp, I don't think it's necessary to get a diagnosis. Yes, organizations are seemingly being more open to people with ADHD, but I've been on numerous calls where people say that their employers do not give them extra support. So I think if you're speaking to your employer, surely they hopefully will treat you the same if you've self-diagnosed as opposed to if you have an official diagnosis.
Yeah.
So completely, I think depends on the individual and what they are trying to get out of a diagnosis.
That's really, really helpful because, as you say, I think there's a lot of people who definitely do know they do tick the boxes, but they've learned how to over the years manage their symptoms. And I think one of the things that I want to just finish on is that if women are diagnosed late in life, there's an element of, in some women, of anger, and as well as shame and embarrassment and frustration. Do you have any kind of words of wisdom for those people who feel that their life's been wasted, or they would have made different choices if they knew that, if they'd had a diagnosis earlier on?
That's a really good question, and I feel like it might be best answered by a coach or a psychotherapist rather than me. But my 2 cents take on it is, if you are older and you had been diagnosed earlier, I don't think there would have been the capacity for it to have changed your life. People didn't know enough about it 30, 40, 50 years ago to actually really support somebody in it. And also, what I would love people to get to is celebrating ADHD. I think it is, and this again is my opinion, nowhere is there scientific research on it, but we need to evolve to be able to survive in the world that is going to be there in 10 or 20 years' time. People with an ADHD brain think outside the box, have many more ideas than neurotypical people do, and just are willing to try different things. Let's start celebrating that part of ADHD. You know, as poor neurotypical people are the ones that are going to be struggling, I think, or hopefully in 10 or 20 years' time, because we can't adapt and haven't created new ways of doing things. So I think what I'm hoping is that we get to that point. I think it is an evolutionary thing that more people are having ADHD because we need to be thinking differently to survive in 10, 20, 30 years' time.
That's a brilliant positive to leave this episode on. I think that's wonderful, Dana. Thank you so much once again. Fabulous. So how do people find you if they do want to know more about what you have to offer and they just want to check you out? Where do they go?
Thank you so much, Vicky. My website is probably the best place because I do have some resources for ADHD people specifically. So that is www.dc-nutrition.co.uk. And I am on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, but LinkedIn is definitely more my social media of choice.
Fantastic. And guys, if you are trying to scribble the notes down, don't worry. We will put the links in the show notes and in the description if you're watching on YouTube. So thank you once again for helping us to just get a little bit more clued up on ADHD and hormones and just being a woman. And let's just get to that point where we can celebrate having a brain that works out of the box. Fantastic. Yeah. Guys, as usual, thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed what you've heard, please do hit that subscribe button and give us a like, give us a thumbs up. And if you think that this episode is going to be useful to somebody else, point them in the direction of it. And I will leave you with this, as always. We only have one life, as far as we know, and one body. So look after it because it is looking after you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, does it want to end?